The MAH NISHTANA. So first with the history of the MAH NISHTANA, we discussed this a little bit last week, but just recap it quickly. This comes from the Rebbe's Haggadah. We mentioned this last week where the MAH NISHTANA was a prototype of how the general Haggadah came together in conglomeration. And the Rebbe writes out like this, and the reason, Yesh Lemar, the reason why there are discrepancies as to how many questions or to what the order of the questions are, or to if there's 4, if there's 5, and when these 4 and 5 were introduced. The Rebbe says the reason is Ki al-Pi Din. We mentioned this last week, so I'm kind of going through quickly, but Ki al-Pi Din, because by Jewish law, in Ma'akav Lim, B'dafka Kol HaKushiyos, one's not required to say all the questions. Right? Because you mentioned last week, the Torah commands that there should be a question and an answer. It doesn't say what the question should be. And over time, customs emerged. Not even in the first instance, meaning to say, if you didn't do it at all, you can still fulfill your obligation. As the Gemara story, which we'll actually learn later. And therefore, to begin with, there were various customs as to how the questions was asked, because they were just following the general pattern. The pattern is ask a question, give the answer. So choose your own questions. There was no custom at all until after some time, during the time while the temple still stood. The Rambam says explicitly, which is unique because it's part of the pilpul that Rabbi gives there. The manhagim came together, and they decided to say all 5 questions, one of which we don't ask because the 5th question is about the carbon pesach, the paschal offering, which we don't have today. In all places, so they should all do it in one way. And we talked about last week how it's compared to the shofar blowing, where different interpretations of what crying meant came together. So likewise here. So that's the history of the 4 questions. The original point is the child should ask, and how they ask and what they ask, Torah doesn't say, and over time customs emerged, and this became the set practice. Okay, so let's see the original text and the halacha of the 4 questions. The halacha. It's a little out of order. We'll have to skip around a bit. Okay. So first comes from the Mishnah in Pesachim, which we read last week. So I'm going to read it in the Hebrew and translate, but you can look at the English under it. Mazgulei kaisheni, the second glass of wine is prepared. So it's not drunk yet, but it's just prepared. The kana ben shoyel aviv, and at this point is when the child should ask his father. Right? The Torah says 4 different times, as mentioned last week. The Torah says 4 different times that when your child asks the question, "What are we doing tonight?" and you explain to him. So at this juncture, where after you prepare your second glass of wine, the child asks, "V'im ein das beben." If the child doesn't have his own mind to think of a question on his own, of Mibalanda, the father teaches him. MAH NISHTANA, what makes this night different, etc., etc. Just parenthetically, I saw something interesting. Why does it say? How do we translate MAH NISHTANA in English?
Why is this night different from?
Why is this not different from all the nights? What's the translation of the word ma?
What?
No.
So what does it mean? Why?
Where did why come from?
Right.
So, parenthetically, stop. This is a little interesting anecdote. If you want to throw this in there. First of all, in the simple reading, the word ma comes from the pasuk. When the simple son asks, ma. The simple son asks, ma edis. No, they all ask, ma v'edis lachem. What does this work for you? Ma edis v'achukim. What is these laws and judgments? So the verse uses the word ma. But another thing I read, interesting, was that when one asks why, they're asking to prove a point. When one asks what, they're asking because they want to know. And the proper way to ask a question is not to prove a point, because you want to know the answer. That's the healthy way to ask questions. Right? In other words, you can ask a question because you're a prosecutor and you want to make a point. And that's when you would say why. Why this? Why that? Why this? As opposed to, can you please explain to me what's going on here? Using the word what, as opposed to why. It's an interesting little something. It's a way of teaching children how to ask questions. You're asking a question, ask because you want to know, not because you want to prove a point. You want to know the question, you want to know the answer, ask the question, we'll give you an answer. You want to prove your point, and now you're not asking questions, now you're not asking any questions anymore, you're getting into an argument. Right? So it's what versus why. It's not an interesting point. Right? Okay. But back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah here says that the child asks. If the child doesn't know how to ask, then the father teaches him. The implication is that the set text is for who?
Son.
But for which kind of son?
The simple.
The one does not ask. So in other words, this is the text. In other words, and ideally, the kid should be smart enough say, what are you doing here? Assuming he didn't go to school for the last month and a half and learn about the Seder. Right? But he's not, so we're teaching him the text. So here the Gemara tells us a story. Why is the plate, the table moved away? So today we just, the Chabad custom is to uncover the kaira, to cover the kaira, cover the matzah. Others has the custom to push away the actual kaira, to push away the plate. But in Talmudic times, they actually sat at little miniature tables, right? You ever seen like a picture of like a Roman dining room, living room looking things? Where everybody is lying on these divans. They're called divans, and everybody has a little table in front of them. So they would physically take the table out of the room. They would take the table away. That's what used to happen. And that was like puzzling. The kid, you're sitting down to a meal, they didn't start eating, and now the table's moved away. What's going on? So the Gemara asks, why do we take the table away? They used to say in the study hall of Rav Yanai, so the children should understand, and they should ask questions. So it's the first bizarre thing we do is taking away the table before we start eating. In the English on the bottom, the bold is the actual text of the translation, and the regular text, not the bold, is the Steinsaltz's commentary. So now the Gemara tells us the story. Abaye Yosef Kamei de Rabba. Abaye was sitting in the presence of Rabba. Abaye was presumably a child here, and Abaye later grew up to be one of the great sages of the Gemara. But Abaye, as the Gemara tells us elsewhere, is actually an orphan. He was an orphan, he was a Yosem. And he was adopted by, I think, his uncle, Rabba. I think Rabba was his uncle, if I'm not mistaken. So he was brought up by his uncle. So now he's at his uncle's Seder table, the great Rabba. Rabba means the great one. He's but the great sage. And he's sitting at the Seder. Chaza, and he saw the medali taka mekame. They were taking away the plate from in front of him. Amar lahu, so Abaye told his uncle Rabba, Adayin lo kachlinu, we haven't eaten yet. Asu kamaki taka mekamein, and now you're coming and taking away the table? What's going on? Amar le Rabba, so Rabba responded, Patartan milim MAH NISHTANA. By the very fact that you picked up on that and asked the question, we are no longer obligated to read the MAH NISHTANA. Thank you very much. Go straight to Avodah Mayinu. In other words, I don't know if he didn't tell him before that he was going to move the table away. He had no idea about the whole order of the Seder. So he set it up in such a way that Abaye, a clever boy, later became a sage, was able to ask the question on his own. So Rabbi tells him, oh, this is what I was hoping for, no need for MAH NISHTANA. Again, this is indicating that the text of the MAH NISHTANA in the halachic sense is just for either one of two extremes. Either because the child doesn't know how to pick up any questions on his own, so you have to teach him questions to ask, or because everybody knows all the answers already, and now you need to ask questions, so here's your set questions. All right? Okay, so you go to the next page, kind of skip the first reading there, go to the second one, the bottom. MAH NISHTANA, that comes from the Rid, Ben Yishaya of, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, D, which means from, Trani, it's a place in Italy. Anybody know? Some place in Italy. You see the dates of when he lived in. 1180 to 1250. Sorry? You know where it is? Torino, there we go. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. So it's Rabbi Yishai of Torino. That's it. Okay. So he says like this. MAH NISHTANA lalazeh. Why is it not different than other nights? Pirush Rabbi Yishai. Rabbi Yishai explains, that's all blessed memory. This is Rabbi Yishai of Torino. Zen Nitgan. This was established. He elucidates what we just explained. For one who has no one else to ask, doesn't have someone to ask of him, and that's why he has to have this system. If he had a child who was smart enough to ask the question on its own, he would not need to say the MAH NISHTANA. Just like the story of Abaye. Rabbi was sitting before Rabba. They saw that they were taking away the plate. Pirush, meaning took away the table. Amar, and Abaye asked, have we eaten yet that you're taking away the table? Amar le Rabba, Rabba told him, you have exempted us from saying MAH NISHTANA. But in an instance where he has no one who's smart enough to pick up on his own, a child smart enough to pick up on his own and ask the question, they need to ask each other. Ba'afilu shnei tamei chacham, even if they're both sages, habakim b'hilchos Pesach, that are both fully versed in the laws of Pesach. So you have two extremes, as I mentioned before. The Mishnah itself, which says that if your child is not smart enough, teach him to say MAH NISHTANA, that teaches you that if your child is not smart enough, teach him the text. But from the story of Abaye, and by the fact that Rabbi told Abaye, by your question, you've exempted us from saying MAH NISHTANA, the implication is that had Abaye not asked the question, we would have to say MAH NISHTANA, even though I know all the answers already. So you get both extremes. Thus leaving basically that the MAH NISHTANA becomes an obligation for everybody nowadays. Because even your simplest children, either one of two things. Either they're too young to ask you questions about what's going on, or they're old enough to have learned from school the answers and to know what's going on. So essentially, what emerges is that the MAH NISHTANA almost becomes an obligation. In order to fulfill your commandment of asking and answering questions, you need to be asking at least something of the MAH NISHTANA, even if not the full text, as Rabbi said, as the text emerged over time. Okay, so now we got the history, the halacha. Let's do the Chassidus angle, and we'll conclude with that. As an introduction to the Chassidus angle of the MAH NISHTANA, we go like this. Haben Shoel, quote, this is a quote from the previous Rebbe. Haben Shoel, the text of the Haggadah's instruction reads, at this juncture the child should ask. So says the previous Rebbe, Zeh shatinuk dafshke shoel, the fact that the young children specifically asks, Ma'orer l'mayla, awakens above in heaven, ha'inyin, this idea, T'chinar Yisrael v'ohevu, that Israel, the Jewish people, are, this is a quote from a verse, that the Israel are like a young child, a young beloved child to Hashem. So by the child asking the question of the father, it's eliciting that God should look at us like a young child. And for some reason, the same question that a 9-year-old asks isn't as cute as when a 2-year-old asks it. It's just the way it is. So specifically, the young children should be asking the questions. It's one of the, at least in my parents' home, I don't know if this is a universal custom, start from youngest to oldest. And this idea of the young children asking the question elicits from Hashem that we have this relationship with Him where we are His young child. Kosov Hamadabu, which this verse indeed speaks, Bismandi Mitzrayim, in reference to the Exodus from Egypt. So that's first of all. Now going from there, we come to the next thing. The Rebbe explains each of the 4 questions on a Hasidic level, and it's predicated on this idea that Lila, we're asking why is this night different than all of the nights? Lila is comparable to exile. And moreover, as Medrash keeps on repeating a bunch of times, there are 4 exiles. So there's 4 questions, there's 4 exiles, all about the night. Night is exile. So the content of the question really is, each of the questions as to what's different is another item that we are indicating about what was missing in previous exiles, then the final redemption won't be missing. In other words, why is this night different? Because it's not going to be deficient like the previous ones. The previous exiles were deficient in their redemption, and therefore there was an exile afterwards. But ours won't be. How so? In these 4 manners. So in 4 different ways, our night, our exile, is different than other nights. Other nights, other exiles were deficient in some manner, but ours is not, in 4 ways. And then we'll go through each of the 3 questions. Each of the 4 questions. So the first question is why dip twice in the Chabad order. The first question is why we dip twice. So I write here deficiency in previous redemption lacked cleansing from either type of sin, physical or spiritual. Right? As we mentioned before, exile is associated with sin and distance from Hashem. And generally speaking, there are 2 types of sin. Sin associated with the body, or sin associated with the soul. Like mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are divided into mitzvahs that are related to, that I do with my physical body, eating kosher, even putting on tefillin to some degree. And then there are more spiritual mitzvahs. Prayer, study of Torah, love Hashem, fear Hashem, loving a fellow Jew. So, in one way or another, in previous times, they didn't dip. Dip as in like a tefillah, into mikvah, going into a mikvah. The word we use litbal to dunk. Like the same word we used to go to mikvah, cleansing. So in previous exiles, they didn't cleanse from both of these things. They didn't have shnei matbilin. They didn't have 2 dunkings. But in this one, we will have dipping, cleansing twice. That is to say, cleansing from both type of sin, physical and spiritual. Next, the second question is why chametz and matzah? So of course, we all know that chametz represents ego. The bread rises, and matzah is flat, doesn't rise, and symbolizes humility. And of course, behind the root of all sin is ego. A person's humble before Hashem, it's not sinning. A person only sins when they put their own needs before Hashem's desires. So, in previous exiles, they were either chametz or matzah. We say every other night was chametz or matzah. So in other words, some people were more humble, some were less humble, but it wasn't, the Jews hadn't reached a state of complete and full devotion and humility to Hashem so that they can attain a full redemption. And thus they were deficient in that way. But in our night, it's all matzah. Our night, our final exile, brings us to complete, full humility, and thus full connection to Hashem. Why only Mara is the third question. So the Rebbe explains like this: when a person is, when a person's doing something they really like to do, you're doing something you really enjoy doing, and all of a sudden you get hungry. The hungry is almost an annoyance because I was so much enjoying myself. I have to stop now to eat, and it's like a buzzkill. It ruins the whole thing. I was having such a good time, it was going so well, and now all of a sudden I have to go eat. So if a person is so engaged in connecting to Hashem, then all of his physical necessities, his food, becomes like a chore that he has to get over with. So it's like maror. It's a bitter thing he has to go through to get it done because he's a human being. He needs to eat. So in previous redemptions and previous exiles and their redemptions, their enjoyment of divinity wasn't to the point where they were only eating maror. They were eating vegetables and maror. To some degree they enjoyed the physical world, and some degree they didn't enjoy the physical world because they weren't fully immersed in divine reality. But in our exile, it's all maror. Not all bitter, but it's going to be so fully invested in divine enjoyment that the notion of eating is going to be like maror. It's like this thing that we have to just get over with because we're human people, we need to eat. It's a beautiful twist. And then finally, on all the nights we sit and we lean, but tonight we all lean. So both sitting and leaning are things you do when you rest. You sit down for a minute and you rest, you lean, you also rest. The difference between leaning and sitting is when you sit, you're expecting to get up soon, or you're engaged in some activity. When you're leaning, you're lying down, it's because you don't plan on getting up for a while. So they're both rest, but one's a temporary rest and one's a more permanent rest. The other rest is a more permanent nature. So in previous exiles, their redemption was like a sitting state. It wasn't a permanent redemption. They were resting temporarily until the next one. But in our night, at the end of our night, it'll be only kula mesubin, only leaning, a permanent redemption that's beautiful both physically and spiritually for all of us, may it happen without delay. Next week, God willing, any requests for which passages we should do?
Whatever you say.
Alrighty.